All right.
All right, now we have Bobby Shirley up.
Awesome. The
Bobby.
and
Hey guys.
look, we have not had all the people that keep getting on here, Mike, are good looking, and
Yeah. Yeah, it's
I don't
amazing.
know about that.
well, all right.
Well, thanks for being on here, Bobby. Bobby
Yeah.
is a drummer. He's been married to his wife Anna for a decade now and is a proud father of four who lives in Alabama, and he blogs about his journey down the slippery slope of grace at bobbyshirley.com. Thanks for being on here, Bobby.
Thanks for having me.
Slippery slope. All right.
Slippery slope of grace.
That's right.
This wasn't a family show, I'd say something here, but so Bobby, what brings you to Jesus today, and or Tripp's book?
Yeah, I'm very intrigued by the book. I've only got to really kind of skim it, for a couple of days or so. But I love the general thought process through the book that I see so far. My question kind of maybe kind of deviates a little bit from the overarching side of the book, but I would love to hear Tripp's thoughts on Jesus, the man, as a preacher of hyper law, as it seems, and yet when Paul comes along, it seems that Paul paints Jesus' teachings as grace, and just kind of how those two somewhat reconcile.
And while you do that, Tripp, I'm going to take a moment. I'll be right back.
All right. Well, one of the things that I actually think is helpful, even in the phrase of it, hyper law, much like it's saying it's doing a lot more than just what law does. In the teachings of Jesus, I think there is a inherent critique of how the law functions, right? Like, does the law, as the people of God, the kind of religious law, function to separate people or unite them? Does it function to care for the people that are present or to dismiss them? And his tension, if you were to kind of like parse how he does Torah debates, is around what's the outcome of how the law is used. Then I think there's another question around how the law itself functions, because a lot of times you can talk about the law, religious law, political law, social law, cultural law, like what is the discourse of domination that defines what is normative and expected and true. And I think philosophically, the critique of law functioning like that in Jesus' thought coheres quite radically with what Paul does. And maybe say it this way. So like political theorists that kind of talk about law will recognize that, like, when we say something's good or true or whatever, it's not as if that's immediately obvious. Underneath it is this assumption that the good, the true, the beautiful has some external reality to it. So when you talk about truth, there's a collection of things that kind of get boxed in. And then this whole collection functions as the law. It's the singular reality. And what I think Jesus and Paul are doing is to highlight how we use the phrase law. It functions on us as a people, and then we're unaware that the box or reality the law is inscribing actually excludes all sorts of people, ignores all sorts of problems of power and things. And so Jesus and Paul are threatening the structure that the law supports, right? Like,
Sure.
Sometimes the law, we talk about the law as if it's just assumed and normal and natural. Yet we also know periods in history where the law was threatened by justice. And the difference between justice and the law is a revelatory moment for recognizing the futility of the law itself. And Jesus and Paul kind of bring that difference to the fore.
Sure. And I think the idea that, I mean, you can hear it in the Beatitudes. You've heard it said, as the status quo norm of the law. And he says, but I say to you, and what he's saying in essence is ratcheting up the requirements of the law, but underneath it is dealing with the status quo and dealing with those that are kind of connected to, I mean, it brings it to a more personal level, I guess, social and things like that. So I do agree with what you said. I haven't really thought about it in those terms though. So,
well, even about the "but I say unto you" thing, one of the things I actually like about it is the ratcheting is a turn from morality as objective performance to subjective awareness. So you've heard it said, like, don't have sex with your neighbor's wife or whatever, right? And you're like, all right, I can avoid that. And then Jesus is like, well, actually, what I was thinking is that when you look at another person, you don't turn them into an object of your pleasure, even your fantasy. That become a person who relates to other human subjects with the dignity of their subjectivity. Do not turn them into objects of your pleasure. Now that tension, that ratcheting up, also breaks the law as some external thing that's being imposed, and then turns us towards cultivating a personhood or subjectivity that gives dignity to the other, because we like to be able to relate things. So like Mike and I have been friends a long time, but Mike and I each have an idea of the other one in their head. And our idea of each other is enough that we trust each other to tell each other all sorts of vulnerable things we're not going to say on Blab. And over time, that trust builds. We share more and more with each other. Then occasionally go backwards and reevaluate stuff you said. But all the time, we're trying not to let our image and understanding of the person just fall into some object. So when I call Mike or he calls me, I'm like, I'm talking to my idea of Mike. Mike says something different than that. I go, oh, Mike, you're supposed to be like Mike, which is my object of you. So sure. Even there in that ratcheting up, Jesus is going, there is an ultimate mystery in the otherness of the person before you. And to be a disciple is to learn to attend to that mystery of the other, and not squelch it and turn it to an object of your pleasure right there in the sex one, but that goes through what is an enemy. An enemy is someone who's been dehumanized so that you can't attack them. Why do you pray for them? So they cease to get the label that it justifies your dehumanization. Anyway.
No, I love that. I completely agree that, Jesus in his coming and dying and raising again was to restore value to the human, and to make what was once devalued valued again. You hear it through his parables and things like that. But what do you think about the idea? I've heard it several times, and I tend to agree, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on Jesus is perfect theology.
Well, I guess there's one part where it just is problematic, right? Theology. I think a lot of people are tempted to do Jesusology. And what that is you like take the Gospels and you run them through your historical ringer, and then you get out your historical Jesus, and it probably looks like an enlightened, overeducated first world person in the late 20th century, early 21st. And then you develop a kind of spirituality and piety around your Jesusology. And the unique thing about theology is not Jesus as just a historical accident, but Jesus' life, ministry, death, and resurrection as God's own self-testimony about who God is. So It becomes theology when the life, ministry, and death, resurrection of Jesus, the continued presence of the risen Christ in the Christian community, the gift of the Spirit throughout all creation, that those places and things are identified as a revelation of who God is. And the Gospels themselves, and I talk about it in the book, actually protest us doing theology with just the historical Jesus, because they're narrating this experience of God that ceased or didn't cease at the cross. Their experience of God mediated by Jesus was alive and continued after the resurrection. So when you say like, oh, Jesus is good theology, you go, oh, no, like good theology. Jesus, the life of Jesus opens up the space for doing good theology, but it's precisely because it opens up the particularities of who God is as God was revealed in Christ. The other thing about like Jesus is good theology you could take it as a positive affirmation to say that when Christian theologians do theology that doesn't both come from our reflection on the cross, dead Christ, but also isn't prodded and disturbed by the cross, then it's bad theology. And one of the biggest critiques, I think, the most important things for the Western church to see is how a cruciform really fails to address questions of justice, of suffering, of radical evil today. And that when Jesus is unrelated to our theology, surprisingly, God starts to be the guarantor of the privilege and power that reigns today, rather than the provocateur of this radical insurgence of love, justice, and compassion. So in that sense, you could take in a positive way.
So we're at time. Bobby, do you have any final word to say to what Tripp just said?
Yeah, I think the idea of making Jesus the complete and total encapsulation of theology and limiting it there, the historical Jesus being that, it must continue, to present day and future. So I would tend to agree, but I'm not sure that I've worded it well enough to get a full understanding of my thought. So,
well, like I've been telling our guests, when you blog about this afterward and embed your interview segment, would love to hear you once you've had time to fully digest your thoughts and share there. That'd be awesome.
Yeah. Thanks so much, guys.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.